He said, "Man, that sure is some good-looking stagecoach. That's what they call a motor, a bus, a motorhome."
Ernest
For 60
Borgnine spent close to 7 decades in front of a camera. He played killers, cops, sergeants, sailors, and a cartoon superhero in a snorkel mask. He worked with Frank Sinatra, Spencer Tracy, Joan Crawford, Shelley Winters, and half of Hollywood's toughest personalities, and by most accounts, he came away from those sets with genuine respect for almost everyone he stood across from. Almost everyone. Because there's one name that, even decades later, Borgnine could never fully let go of, and it isn't who most people expect. It wasn't a director. It wasn't a rival actor who upstaged him. It was someone who shared his own last name for exactly 38 days. Before we get to that story, it helps to understand who Ernest Borgnine actually was, because the man behind the gruff voice and the gap-toothed grin had a life that reads almost like fiction on its own. He was born Ernest Borgnine in January 1917 in Hamden, Connecticut, the son of Italian immigrants. When he was a toddler, his parents separated, and his mother took him to Italy, where he spent several of his earliest years immersed in a culture and language that had nothing to do with the country he'd been born in. When his parents reconciled and the family returned to the United States, his father anglicized the family name, and young Ernest grew up in New Haven with no particular interest in performing. He wasn't the theater kid. He was the kid who liked sports. What actually launched his life wasn't a stage, it was the Navy. He enlisted straight out of high school in 1935 and served aboard a destroyer for 6 years, earning an honorable discharge in 1941. 2 months later, Pearl Harbor happened, and he went right back in, serving through the rest of World War II and eventually rising to gunner's mate first class. By the time he was discharged in 1945, he'd spent a decade of his life in uniform, and acting wasn't even on his radar. He seriously considered making the Navy a career. It was his mother who changed the trajectory of his life, telling him that with his big, forceful personality, he ought to try acting. He had no training, no connections, and no real plan, but he enrolled in drama school in Hartford and then joined a regional theater in Virginia where, in the earliest days, actors were sometimes paid in food instead of money. He took whatever came his way: small roles, backstage labor, the unglamorous grind of summer stock, and slowly built foundation. By 1949, he made it to Broadway, appearing alongside James Stewart in a long-running production of Harvey, and by the early 1950s, television and film were both calling. His breakout film role came in 1953's From Here to Eternity, where he played Staff Sergeant Fatso Judson, a sadistic stockade guard who beats Frank Sinatra's character to death. It's one of the most disturbing sequences in a film full of them, and it worked so well that audiences had trouble separating Borgnine from the character. He later said people recognized him for years afterward as the guy who killed Frank Sinatra. What's often exaggerated in modern retellings is the idea that Sinatra himself held a grudge over it. In interviews Borgnine gave later in life, he described the opposite: that both he and Sinatra were nervous heading into their scenes together, that they supported each other through it, and that Sinatra even talked about grabbing a drink with him after they wrapped a difficult fight sequence. Whatever tension existed on screen, it doesn't appear to have followed them off it. 2 years later came the role that changed everything: Marty, made on a shoestring budget of roughly $343,000, in which Borgnine played an ordinary, lonely butcher looking for love. It was about as far from Fatso Judson as an actor could get, and it won him the Academy Award for Best Actor in 1955, beating out contenders like James Dean. He was 38 at the time, and by his own account, he'd barely been considered for the role until a chance meeting at a party led to a screen test. From there, his career took him everywhere. Westerns like Bad Day at Black Rock and The Wild Bunch, war epics like The Dirty Dozen, where in his 50s he insisted on doing his own stunts, and disaster films like The Poseidon Adventure, where he played a tough New York detective navigating a capsized ocean liner, alongside Gene Hackman and Shelley Winters. On television, he became a household name through McHale's Navy, a role that drew directly on his real naval service, and decades later he introduced himself to an entirely new generation as the voice of Mermaid Man on SpongeBob SquarePants, a part he reportedly landed after his grandson kept telling him he should be on the show, and after auditioning on the spot at a charity event with nothing but a napkin to read from. Professionally, the picture that emerges from Borgnine's long career is one of a workman actor who got along with almost everyone. Co-stars who worked with him on tense, physically demanding productions, people like Shelley Winters on The Poseidon Adventure, or the cast around the infamous Joan Crawford, Mercedes McCambridge Feud on Johnny Guitar, generally remembered him as a steady, professional presence in the middle of other people's storms, not someone stoking his own. He wasn't the guy causing the drama on set. He was usually the one standing there watching it happen, which is exactly why the one relationship he never fully made peace with stands out so sharply. It wasn't a director who fired him or a co-star who sabotaged a scene. It was his third wife, Broadway legend Ethel Merman. Borgnine married 5 times over the course of his life, and each of the first 4 marriages taught him something, often painfully. His first marriage to Rhoda Keemans began before he was famous and ended in 1958 as his career took off. His second, to Mexican actress Katie Jurado, was passionate and combustible and lasted until 1963. But nothing compares to what happened next. In June 1964, Borgnine married Ethel Merman, one of the biggest stars Broadway had ever produced, the voice behind Annie Get Your Gun and Gypsy, a performer whose belt could reportedly be heard in the back row without a microphone. On paper, it looked like a genuine Hollywood meets Broadway pairing. In practice, it fell apart almost immediately. According to contemporary reporting, their honeymoon to Japan turned tense as fans mobbed Borgnine wherever they went, and Merman, who was used to being the center of attention herself, reportedly felt sidelined. By early August, a little over a month after the wedding, the separation was public. The marriage had lasted somewhere between 32 and 38 days, depending on which account you read, making it one of the shortest celebrity marriages on record at the time. What makes this story different from an ordinary quickie Hollywood divorce is what happened afterward, or rather, what didn't happen. Merman never gave a real public explanation for the collapse of the marriage. She simply stopped discussing it. Years later, when she published her autobiography, she included a chapter titled, My Marriage to Ernest Borgnine. Readers who turned to that page found it completely blank. No text, no explanation, just white space where an entire chapter of her life should have been. It's hard to overstate how pointed that gesture was. Merman had built a career on filling a room with her voice, and here she was, choosing total silence as her final word on the man she'd married. For Borgnine, it clearly stung in a way that outlasted the marriage itself. In later interviews, he acknowledged that the blank page affected him more than any angry statement could have, that it felt like a public rebuke he couldn't respond to, because there was nothing there to respond to. Whatever anger, embarrassment, or hurt existed between them, Merman took her side of it to the grave in 1984, and by most accounts, the two never reconciled or spoke publicly about each other again. It's worth being clear about the caveats here because so many old Hollywood feud stories get inflated online with details that were never actually verified. There's no credible evidence of a physical altercation between Borgnine and Merman, no confirmed on-set violence, and no substantiated claim that Merman ever spoke publicly about him in anger. What's documented is simpler and in some ways more striking. An extremely short marriage, a public separation, and then total, deliberate silence from one of the loudest voices in American entertainment, a silence that outlived the marriage by 2 decades. By contrast, Borgnine did go on to find lasting stability. In 1972, he met Norwegian businesswoman Tove Tresnes at a party in Las Vegas. They married in 1973, and unlike his previous marriages, this one lasted nearly 4 decades, longer than all his other marriages combined. Tove built a successful cosmetics company, and Borgnine became something of a public partner in that business, later joking that he was probably the oldest living face in a beauty ad campaign. In interviews late in his life, he credited that relationship with giving him the stability the earlier chapters of his life had lacked. When he passed away in July 2012 at the age of 95, Tove was reportedly by his side. So, why does the Merman story still resonate the way it does, more than 60 years later? Partly because of the sheer brevity of it, a marriage that barely outlasted a summer vacation. Partly because of that blank page, which remains one of the more quietly devastating gestures in celebrity memoir history. And partly because it doesn't fit the image people have of Ernest Borgnine, the affable tough guy who got along with practically everyone he ever worked with. This wasn't a professional rivalry or an ego clash on a film set. It was personal, it was brief, and it ended not with an argument, but with silence loud enough to be heard for the rest of both their lives. Borgnine built a legacy most actors would envy, an Oscar, a war record, decades of beloved television work, and a voice role that introduced him to children who had no idea he'd once played one of the most frightening villains in 1950s cinema. But if there's one chapter of his own life he never quite closed the book on, it's the one Ethel Merman closed for him, literally, on a blank page, in her own memoir, in a chapter with his name in the title and nothing else underneath it. That more than any tabloid rumor about a set-side brawl or a coffee cup thrown in anger, is the real story of the co-star, or in this case, the wife, Ernest Borgnine, never fully got over.